on this computer. Here we go. Um, Hi, welcome to the Newbie Callers Saturday session. Don Beck, who is somewhere here, and I are the usual hosts. And uh, this week we've decided that I'm going to talk. In various other presentations, I've seen a whole bunch of things about music. People wondering about music theory. Well, what does a male key mean? What does a female key mean? And I'm not a particular expert on these things, but back in high school, I played a trumpet, which is a monophonic instrument, one note at a time. It was a rule in our family that everybody had to play an instrument till you got through high school. Once I got done with high school, I threw that sucker under the bed, and recently I gave it away to a young man who was learning to play trumpet. And um, so I'm having to relearn kind of a lot of audio stuff because I'm doing a lot of audio production now, and I know how to read music, and that's about where it ended. So let's just start off with something fairly simple. I'm going to share
Dan,
screen here. Yo.
I before you get started, I want to introduce you. We're having Dan today, but basically, you've already taught me something. I wasn't sure what you meant by a monophonic instrument. I apologize for having bowed out. I got a telephone call from somebody I've been trying to contact for 2 or 3 days, and he finally called back, and it was in reference to a future session on here. So I didn't want to let him get away. At least we're going to talk later, but I got the general gist to it. So with my apologies for interrupting as I usually do, take it away, Dan. We see you.
All right. So presumably at this point, you can now all see some sort of screen that you do not understand at all, right? And hopefully you're about to hear this.
And you're recording, are you not?
I am recording, yes.
Thank you.
Whoops. Why are you not? Okay, so that was a 440 hertz sine wave. What that basically means is it kind of waves up and down 440 times a second. It is a useful tone because that's what we commonly refer to as A4. Um, the thing is, one of the interesting things is that that note has moved around historically. If you talk to old music fans, they'll say that A4 is something more like this. Very subtly different, but I guess one of the points here is that there are no absolutes in music. A lot of it is about what you hear, what you feel. The other thing is that I can't guarantee that anything that I'm playing here that I hear, because I'm listening to them through some very nice studio reference headphones, is what's happening, what you hear, because Zoom is compressing all of this audio, sending it out to you, and it's being played over whatever you happen to be listening on it, all of which have completely different characteristics. So hopefully we'll get this kind of together. So let's go on to the next thing. We'll go back to the 440 hertz again, that A, and so that sounds slightly less annoying because it's got an envelope applied to it. Rather than being one solid constant tone, it falls off slightly. And then we're going to go over and try something else. So that's a tone that was made by amplifying that 440 hertz note up so high that the equipment that I was working on it on had to clip it off and turn it into kind of a square wave. And let me see if I can go find that. Zoom in here a little bit. So we can see it waving up and down here, but it's clipped on and off at the top. And we'll go compare that to this, where you can see it's nice and smooth waving back and forth. So a guy named Fourier figured out that you can represent any wave with a bunch of other waves by summing them together. So what you're hearing here psychologically is that 440 hertz dominant tone, and then a whole bunch of higher notes in there that are making things sound a little harsher, a little brighter. So maybe we'll get back around to that. Maybe we won't. But I wanted to throw that as an example of this is something that we hear as the same note, but it has a different shape and therefore different characteristics. And one of the things to think about is that when we sing a note, oh, if we sing that as he, oh, ooh, all of those vowel sounds are coming from other secondary note tones that are being overlaid upon that note. So let's go back in. In Western music, we have decided that we generally break a note or break a, well, let's see here, break a tone. And where are my participants? I need to make sure that I'm letting people in. Admit all. Zoom, you're trying to be too helpful here. In Western music, we break that. Oh, sorry. Let's start with the first thing here. Come back over here. So, the one universal in music is that we tend to hear octaves, which is when you double the rate of change of that pressure, that sound wave. We hear it as the same note but higher or lower. So here's C3, an octave up from that. Those notes are all C. And in between that, in Western music, we break that into roughly, or into 12 kind of equal segments. If you really want to know more about why that isn't always equal, a guy named J.S. Bach wrote a series of compositions ages ago called The Well-Tempered Clavier, which is that instruments have native keys to them, and where we break that is a little bit different depending on where we start and stop the octave. And when they came to piano, they started making compromises about what those intermediate notes were. So, yeah, that's way too deep. We'll not bore you with that. Anyway, here's what the chromatic scale sounds like played all the way through, or played through an octave. If you're a musician, you might have heard that before. If you kind of think about that, when somebody runs up and down a piano keyboard, maybe you've heard that. But what we more often hear is something called a major scale, where we pick the white notes. If I can tap on the white notes right, out of that. So here we go, two of those divisions of 12. And the divisions of 12 are called semitones or half notes. Another two, then we go a half, a whole, a whole, a whole, a half. The interesting thing is that we can pick that same series of notes elsewhere out of a sequence, and come up with something that sounds to our ears very different. This is a minor scale. You'll hear this and then we went back to a major scale. So this is a sequence of notes that you will often hear in music that we associate with being sad music. And this is kind of music that we hear in stuff that we think of as happy music or marching music or things like that. So Shauna has graciously offered us, let me go check my participants again, make sure that I don't have anybody else waiting to come in. Shauna handed out at some point this PDF that gets surreptitiously passed around that talks about what chic recordings means when they say male scale or male key and female key. And the thing is that we can kind of choose that octave anywhere we want to. We have C, and we can also choose it in D. So generally for square dance music, what people think of as a male octave or male key is actually not so much the key, but it's the range of music from C3 to C4. Oh. And what Shauna has picked as the female key, and I think other square dance music producers are starting to follow along on that, is the G major scale, from G3 to G4. Let's try that again. Oh. So you'll notice here that if we come over here to where the keyboard is, that involves banging the B flat note as it chooses where its steps are. So we still have that same whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step sequence. We have simply shifted the major scale from one place on another to the keyboard. The reason this is useful is when I started singing, I had a range, you know, I can start way down here. And we can maybe go up from there. But you'll notice that somewhere around this point, my voice does a little hiccup and wobble. And what's happening is I go from different vocal theorists talk about it as head voice and chest voice, or high register and low register. But my throat is having to do some massive reconfiguration as it pushes the air through one set of vocal cords into another set of vocal cords. So I have this yodel point or break around that point, which meant that whenever I tried to sing traditional square dance music produced for male vocal ranges, it sounded like hell. So what I would traditionally do is I would go down and I would take that sucker down. Let's go back here. Come on. I would take it down an octave down here. And you'll notice that down there in that C2, I'm a little shaky. So and if I get stressed and tensed out in front of a group of people, then my voice is even going to be more shaky. So the traditional square dance music totally did not work for me. But if I came over here to Shauna's music for female voices and took that down an octave, let me just take it down an octave here. And that was a place in my voice where I could do all sorts of interesting things with it. So I would buy the female voice version of music from Shauna. And then I've got an older square dance caller friend who I help out with technical stuff. And I would buy the male voice version of music from Shauna for him. And she would email me saying, hey, what's going on here? Why are you buying both versions? But as my voice has opened up, I can now get both of those ranges. So what does this kind of mean in practice? Let's go back and see if I can show this off a little bit. If we take something like Van Morrison's Moondance, both Van Morrison's Moondance and Smile, which Shauna recently produced, are natively published in G, or whatever the equivalent of G is in a minor key. So this is going to sound really awful because I typed it in from the sheet music, and the real performances of this do all sorts of things with the rhythm that are not carried in the sheet music. But here's the basic melody for Moondance. And then if we go over here to Smile, so those are completely different ranges of music, even though they're in the same key. This one goes from C3 to Smile goes from C3 to A sharp 3, and Moondance goes from A3 up to if I could read music or read keyboards, this would be easier. D, E, F. So even if you took Moondance down an octave, even though those songs are in the same key, they cover different ranges. Is all of this making sense so far? Any questions? So that's what's kind of meant by male key and female key, is not so much the key that the song is in, as in what we choose for the start and stop notes of our octave, but what the range is that's covered by that song. Are we going from, let's back to this track, going from this start and stop note, or that start and stop note. So now that we've been kind of through that, when I said, oh, yeah, I'm totally disoriented or discombobulated here. So when we talk about ranges, if we go in, you have often probably heard the terms soprano, alto, and tenor, and bass in singing ranges. Everybody's range is a little bit different, and there are kind of really 6 coarse groups that singing theorists have dropped these voice ranges into. One of those is soprano, really high. So that's an octave and a half that happens up fairly high. Mezzo soprano is a little bit down from that. Alto is probably about where we think of when we think of what the standard female voice is. Tenor is what we usually think of when we think of a male voice. Baritone is what we think of when we think of a deep voice. And then bass is like that guy in the Statler Brothers, who does the really deep thing down below. So those are kind of the basic vocal ranges, and it's probably a good idea to play with your voice, sing some scales, figure out where your voice lands in those different ranges, so that you can know if you're singing with square dance music, are you going to take it an octave down? Are you going to take it as it's written? If you're going to take it an octave down, can you actually get all of the low notes? If you have something like, if you're going through hell, if you're going through hell, keep on going. Can you actually get down to that low note? Is that going to work for you? So now that we've been through that whirlwind tour here, and once again, if you're, please pipe in with questions, give me some feedback, tell me, help, I'm totally lost, I don't understand what the heck you're talking about. Let's talk a little bit about scales and harmony. I mentioned earlier that there are major scales and minor scales. There are also, and a scale is kind of what notes we choose when we write a song and sing a song. You'll notice that, like with a lot of country and western songs, if you're singing along in the car, you even if it's a new song, you know where that song is going before the singer sings the next note. Or if it's new square dance music, some new singing calls are way easier to learn than others. And the reason for this is twofold: that we have standard chord progressions that underlie most of our music, which is kind of the stuff that Mel posted with the three chords thing, and I posted with the Pachelbel rant, and I'll get around there in just a moment. Um, and that we have scales that we associate with certain kind of music. This is, for instance, a blues scale. So if you hear a blues song, it's probably going to have all notes with those intervals from each other. Oh. Now, it's not that those have to be those exact notes. They can be shifted to any octave. They can even cover multiple octaves if you've got a singer who can do that. But your blues song is going to use those intervals between notes. Similarly, a lot of country and western music uses something called the pentatonic scale, or a pentatonic scale, which sounds like this. Oh. Which brings us to chords. So, um, the, oops, not this one. Let's go solo on this. You have all heard this song over and over again. So this is the bass line or bass set of chords from Pachelbel's Canon in D. And everybody's heard this song over and over again. You have also heard this song or this chord progression in any number of pop songs. I can pull up the list. There's a list. But let's talk about what a chord is first. A chord is a set of notes that sound good together. This is a major chord. This is a minor chord. You can notice it's only different by that one note. We interpret this in Western music as sounding a little bit sadder, maybe. An interesting thing about chords is when you hear people talk about singing harmony, what they're generally talking about is the lead note in a song is often the top note on a chord, or some melody by picking out sounds within that chord. So any of these other chords notes sound good when played along with that. So if you can't hit the top note, if you manage to hit that note, or this note, it'll still sound totally good. So as you're singing along in a melody, and you find as you're practicing that you can't reliably get up to that really high note, and for whatever reason in feeling that music, you don't want to take it down an octave, you can take it down to one of the intermediate intervals, and it'll still sound good along with the music. Similarly, if you are singing with other people and they're all singing the high note, if you sing one of the supporting chord notes, it'll still sound pretty darn good. So let me see if I can find that text Emacs text Pachelbel rant. Um, so just to pull out some of the things that Rob Peravonian mentions in that Pachelbel rant about songs that fit into the Pachelbel uh, chord progression. Vitamin C's Graduation. As we go on, we'll remember. Aerosmith's Crying. There was a time I was so broken hearted. One Tin Soldier, listen children to my story. It was written long ago. Natalie Imbruglia's I'm All Out of Faith. Green Day's Basket Case. U2 With or Without You. Bob Marley's No Woman, No Cry are essentially all Pachelbel's canon in D in terms of the notes that they choose to work with. Um, they're just played with different timing and different choosing a different set of notes for the melody line. The bass line is all exactly the same. So if we go for like, what does all country music sound like? A good portion of country music all sounds like this. And if you become familiar with those chords, you will hear this pattern over and over again. And suddenly you'll find that you can sing along to almost every country song and sound good after one or two passes through, and it will help you expand your repertoire of singing calls absolutely amazingly. Country music is nice because it fits in the 8 bars of square dance music. Another sequence that we often hear is the blues sequence, and this fits in 12 bars, so we probably don't hear it so much in country music, but I'm going to play it for you anyway. So you'll find that if you start listening for these patterns, you will hear them over and over again in all sorts of music. And all of a sudden, that I'm having to practice this over and over again to get this singing call right will become, oh, I recognize this set of intervals and this set of chords, and this is easy now. So, because I'm not getting any questions, I'm just going to keep on running straight through all of my demos. Let's talk a little bit about rhythm. And see if I remember what my demos were, because I didn't really expect to get here. No, don't do that with mute. So there's a basic 4-kick rhythm. And what was I going for here? Oh, here we go. Let's pop over to this section here. So that's our basic 4/4 rhythm. We've got an accent, we've got a boom on the downbeat, and then a slightly lower one on the second beat, or on the third beat. Boom, 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 boom. And then kind of a lower on the intermediate, the second and fourth beat. One of the things that happens with square dance music is that we have everything is 126 beats a minute, and yet dancers will say, wow, that one song has a whole lot of energy and that other song has no energy. What's going on? Or that other song that I like those nice slow mellow songs, and they're all the same speed. The dancers should all be stepping to them at 126 beats a minute. Why does one sound fast and one sound slow? Well, what the difference is what's happening in the intermediate parts of the beat. So if we come over here and put a chuck in between each of those beats, whoop, all of a sudden that plodding slow thing becomes really fast. It's the same beat, they're going to walk at the same speed to it, but it feels like it's moving all of a sudden. That beat that tick in between the beat is called syncopation. And when we talk about what it means to put, or Buddy Weaver talked to me early on in my calling career, and I was saying, yeah, I'm trying to get that auctioneer patter thing going on. You know, bow to your partner, turn bow to your corner two, join hands and circle to the left around that ring you do, where it really kind of kicks. And he said, yes, the trick to that is to practice putting the accent on the syncopated vowel. So where I was thinking, bow to your partner, bow to your corner two, the trick is those consonants, the bow, the B for the bow, the P for the partner, the C for the corner, they're already feeling that as on the beat. If you can give them a little kick in the ow, in the artner, and the orner, then they hear in your voice that syncopation, and they feel a little bit more excitement in the music and energy on that. So if we go back to a pattern like this, where we're putting that in, that extra tick, that kicks even more energy into the floor. And let's go try this one, because I know I made this for a reason. That is roughly the same speed. They're going to move at the same speed to that, but it kind of sounds slower.
Well, than the other, yeah.
So the one more thing that I wanted to kind of cover here, and then we'll definitely start getting your conversation, because I think that I've probably completely lost my audience at this point, is I wanted to play a...
We do have a couple of questions, Dan, but go for it.
Well, lay them on me.
Well, somebody in the chat asked, now I forgot, what about or please talk about the third and fifth.
The third and the fifth. Let's go back to this. If I get this right here. So if I get this right, and one of you people who actually knows stuff here, talk to me. If the root note, where's the C major chord? Oh, solo that one, unsolo this track. There's the root note. That's the first. There's the third. We're counting up in the notes of the scale. So remembering here that on the C major scale, we covered the white keys here. There's the first. Whoops. This all works a lot better if Dan can actually use the tools he's got available to him. There's the first. This is the second. There's the third, fourth, and the fifth. So that is a chord made up of this note. Delete that note. This note. We'll delete these other notes and put a note there and pull these out all to the full range. And there is a chord played with the first, the third, and the fifth. And that sounds like a major chord. Does that kind of cover what you were hoping to have answered?
Well, I wanted people to know that if you can't hit the first note, if you hit the third note when you're trying to sing harmony, you're going to blend in with what they're doing so that you can, that was sort of what I thought we were going to be sort of doing in this session, was we talked about music theory in the first, the third, and the fifth, and talking about singing harmony. The third is where a lot of people can come in if they can't hit that first note. And if everybody's singing the first note, it doesn't sound as good as if somebody's singing the first and the third note.
Oops, sorry. Yeah, that was the third. Yes. Thank you. All right, Don, what you got? Do you have more questions? Okay, well, we're waiting for Don to pipe in with another question. Does somebody else have a question?
Oh, let me see there. Dan, you might want to talk about a little bit about how you can use those three chords, 1, 4, 5, to make up the whole scale, or the fact that if you take the whole scale and apply it, that's exactly what you come out with if you separate it into 3 tones at a time in a kind of acute way.
Let me see if I can. So there's the one chord and the 4 chord and the 5 chord. And so if we drop along there, we get there. Whoops. Now, what was I on? I was on this one. So we're we've got this guy too. So So yeah, in the 1 and the 4 and the 5, we're choosing notes that are only coming from the major scale. And just as a reminder, this is from the 8-bar country and Western progression, where we generally go 1, 4, 5, the 1 chord, the 4 chord, the 5 chord, and back through over and over again. And yes, we're picking the first, the 4th, the 5th, the 6th, the 7th, and those are the only notes that we're essentially playing with as we play the song. Am I getting it roughly right, Keith?
Yeah, if you play, you get, if you play all 3 of those chords, you get all 7 notes in the scale. And there's some overlap. You get a couple of C's from the C and the F, obviously, or the 1 and the 4.
Right.
Yeah. And the other thing that's interesting to note is, with few exceptions, and there are exceptions, these chords, since they do have all the notes in the scale, you can basically make up a song that uses the whole scale if you want to. And that this is why these chords work when you play them with songs that are written on a key that uses that scale. Now, why do the other chords work? You had a 3 chord in Pachelbel. I think it was an F sharp minor. That guy works because he's got notes of the scale in there. Which, let me see, he was in D, okay? So F sharp's in D, okay? And A is in D, that's the 3rd. And then C sharp is in D. So that chord works, it's got notes of the scale. Now, why do you play different notes with different chords? And when you're playing a chord, can you only play the notes that are in that chord from the scale? And the answer to that one is no. You don't have to. There are notes that will work melodically with the scale that aren't with a chord that are from the scale or from the key, but not part of the chord. And, that's all part of the theory of harmony. And, that gets way above my pay grade, as especially since we're all of us are not theoretical musicians, we're practical ones, so that separates theory from practice, but it works. For instance, a lot of times you can sing a D over a C chord and it sounds great. There was one more thing I was going to ask you about, and that was consonance and dissonance, but it sounds like somebody's already got a question. So,
well, and I may not know the answer to that. So, Don, are you back yet with more questions?
Yeah, I'm back. I apologize. I was trying to, the sound on this laptop is pretty bad, so I was trying to hook up some Bluetooth headphones and just lost everything.
Oh, there's your problem. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, somebody asked just a quick question, then I have one. What program, what application are you using on your desktop for us to be looking at all this stuff on?
So the digital audio workstation that I am currently using is called Logic Pro. It is available on a Mac, which is the expensive part. Work bought me a really nice tricked out Mac, so I had that. And Logic Pro only costs $200, and for $200, it is the best cheap way to get a DAW, the best value in digital audio workstations anywhere, because it comes with a huge number of instruments and a whole bunch of functionality. So yeah, if you happen to have a Mac, spend the $200, get it, learn how to use it, even though I don't really know how to use it yet.
It seems to work nicely here.
And in fact, one of the demos that I could also give is it is really easy with this to take a karaoke track or something like that, drop it in, it will detect where all the beats are, and so then you can go in and find like places where your music doesn't have enough rhythm and add instrumental tracks and stuff. Super, super easy. Anyway, back to you, Don.
The question I have is one I had many, many, many years ago and hasn't satisfactorily been answered. And when you were talking about rhythms, you reminded me of it. And knowing pretty much nothing about music other than what I like and what I don't, there was stuff, certain records had certain square dance records had an effect that I really liked and I thought helped make them successful. And I used to think of it as the vocal part was out of phase with the instrumental part. And I could never explain that to anybody. And eventually I learned that it's called pickup beats. And I still don't know exactly what that is or how, but when you're done telling me, if you can tell me something about it, I'll tell you why I thought it was a successful thing in square dance calling.
Well, I believe that some of the people on this call might actually have degrees in music theory and understand some of this stuff. Is there anybody who knows this? Because I can kind of give you a male answer syndrome version of this. I'm seeing smiles, but I'm not seeing any answers. So the two things that I know of are, one of the things that happens that you can hear in rhythms is if you take the snare and the bass and move the snare ever so slightly in front of or behind the bass, you get a sound with the same rhythm. So let's pop back over here. If I can find it again. Is that, I just did volume. Pop back over to this guy. Solo the other tracks. And give us just this rhythm here. And see if we can find it. Why are you not showing me that? There we go. So we've got the kick, and we've kind of got a double kick here, and then we've got the snare. If we take the snare and move it ever so subtly in front of the beat, it kind of gives a little urgency to that beat, and if we take it and move it ever so subtly behind the beat, it kind of makes the rhythm lag a little bit. So I think that's one of the things you're talking about. And you can do obviously the same thing with your vocals, is lag the beat a little bit or come up ahead of the beat. The other thing that happens is, well, you hear the old crooners do this an awful lot, is swing the beat. I get no kick from champagne. I get no kick from champagne. A really bad example, but they're moving around where that secondary beat happens, and you get a completely different feel to things.
I'm familiar with playing around the beat, and your demonstration of moving the snare a little forward or demonstrates the feeling of urgency versus hanging back, but it doesn't come anywhere near the question that I had. So as much as I couldn't explain it 30
I
or
can't
40
explain
years
it either.
ago, I still can't.
So I think the other thing about pickup notes is that you have that sense of where the downbeat is, where that 4 is. Let's pop back over to this one. And if so, I'm trying to think of a song that has this capability. But when I think of a pickup note, I think of it as the dun 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 dun, where that bum 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 is part of what's coming up into the song, and so you're kind of coming in on the syncopation of the second or of the third and the fourth and fourth syncopation note of the previous measure.
That's coming closer to what I was thinking of. Let me
Okay.
explain what little I can, and maybe somebody has an idea. But most records you can take and go count on the beat or count the phrase with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And of course, there are different rhythms like 1, 2, 3, 4, but just basic 1 through 8. If you take the kind of records I'm thinking of, and I can no longer think of any examples of it. If you start listening to the music and the bass, the boom chuck, you'll come up with counting at a certain point. But if you listen to the melody, that the words of the song, they frequently start at a different point than the instrumentation does. And these records that was thinking were pretty good for square dancing, the melody would start 2 beats before the boom chuck. And the reason I thought these worked really well was you could, there's always the debate, do you sing with the phrase or you let the dancers dance with the phrase? And these things would allow me to sing with the phrase, and 2 beats later, they could dance with the phrase. And the records I had that were like that, I could notice a difference with the floor dancing. But again, the question is, I don't really know how to explain it, and I thought the closest.
Are you asking specifically a kind of basically a definition of what is a pickup note and how does it work?
I'm asking if I were going to go to a music producer and say, I want to come up with a song like this, or can you make any song sound like that, or what have you? What language do I use rather than stumbling through what I'm talking about now?
Yeah, I think the term that you're looking at is, it's anacousis or anacrusis anyway, but it's essentially pickup notes. If you look at a musical phrase, let's just say a 4-beat phrase, in that phrase, you've got a specific downbeat. Pickup notes are the beats or the notes that precede that specific downbeat in a musical phrase. And what you see is like in a first measure, unlike everything else, there's fewer beats in that measure, often maybe just 1 or 2 that the time signature indicates. So you'll have 1 or 2 notes that'll precede that first downbeat. It's sort of like an introductory phrase, and that's called a pickup note, where you get da 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 ba 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 da 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 da. That's your pickup phrase, or your pickup notes that go into that. Now, when you start looking at country music, if you want to look at that, that's very different than what Dan was describing as the syncopation or the using of the music. And I always use Willie Nelson as probably one of the best ones for explaining the differences in those two. If you look at the song, You Were Always on My Mind, you've got a very, very strong pickup phrase in that, but Willie is singing off the melody line and off the beat. He does a lot of syncopated singing in that. You are always on my mind, and he'll drop those. But the pickup for the actual melody line is right before that downbeat, and those are the pickup phrase. I think that might be where you're getting at for the introduction.
That's a pretty good example, Mel. That particular one, and I think you're understanding my mumbling here. That particular one is sort of a 3 or 4 beat lead, whereas the ones that I worked on, what I liked were the 2 beat leads. But
yep.
And I can't think of an example, but as I say, I thought pickup notes was the correct terminology.
It is, and the pickup usually, how do you put this? What you'll find in a lot of songs is your pickup or the anacrusis. If you've got a 4 or 6 or an 8, it depends on what kind of rhythm you've got for the music. A lot of the time, they're going to be a lot shorter. So where you've got a 4-beat phrase, you may only have 2 sub beats within that phrase, and that's your pickup that leads into that downbeat. It could be a lot shorter. Sometimes it could be longer. It all depends on what the music producer wants.
What? How do you spell anacrusis? I got to look that up after.
Oh Jesus. ANACRUSIS. Don't quote me on that. I haven't got anything in front of me. So.
Well, I've already written that down on my own. So if phonetically it sounds, unlike most English words, if phonetically it sounds like that, that'll be good.
I did have one comment, Dan. You were when you were talking about classifications of singers. I noticed you mentioned that you got your female range and your male range, and you were talking in that generalized terms. Mm-hmm. Those generalized terms, your soprano, and so on, being the female, the alto and the bass and the tenor being male. Those are more. I mean, they're correct, but I found those are more choral music classifications. I put a little snippet there in the chat. A lot of people that try to assist singers, especially if they don't know, they classify based on chorus or singing in choral or singing in choir. And that for square dance callers is very, very dangerous, because you may be able to sing in a choir, but those keys and those ranges are geared specifically to divide you into categories of singing where your voice falls, rather than where you may be comfortable singing. So it's a big caution, because if you classify yourself as a soprano singer and you want to be a square dance caller, you may sing beautiful soprano in a choir, but you'll be a terrible square dance caller if you limit yourself to that soprano range, because you will probably have a much more comfortable vocal range. And that's what Dan was saying about where you have a scale which runs up in C, you're keeping that exact same scale, but you're dropping in B flat. That's the same as converting to, when you're playing guitar, if you're playing Country Roads in a C, converting it to a B flat, you change all the notes, but the actual scale of where you're singing is exactly the same, just in a different semitone on that scale. I don't know if that made sense to you, but
I often find when I'm learning myself, that my aha moments come from just immersing myself in as much as I can hear, even if I don't understand it in the moment. And then a month later, somebody will say something and I'll go, oh, that's what that was about. So hearing it is always good.
Yeah, I've been trying to make notes from your presentation, Dan. And essentially what I've got is the layman's explanation in your vocal range charts is merely the span between the highest and the lowest notes, if that was correct. And then you classify the different singers into categories, which is their voice type. put a couple notes on the vocal ranges, but they're essentially soprano, contralto, mezzo soprano. And then for men, it's tenor, countertenor, bass, and baritone. Was that correct?
I believe so, yeah. I used the standard Harvard music list of what that was. Oh, I just went soprano, mezzo soprano, alto, tenor, baritone, and bass. So I just used the standard.
Sorry, I'm done. I just want to make sure I get these notes right. So your five, you've talked about the voice qualities, which is the vocal range, the vocal weight, the timbre, the aesthetically pleasantness, which is tessitura, and the passaggio, which is that transition between the vocal registers when you switch from one register to another. So that was just the five of them, correct?
I think that's more detail and more correct terminology than I was using.
And then
my
speech
vocal
and vocal
teacher
registers. You said the lowest voice is a person can produce in the chest. You talked about chest and throat voice. The modal voice is the normal speaking voice, which you talked about. Falsetto is that overlap when that waver. And then you didn't mention whistle, which is that whistle voice, and it's usually, I don't know, like Roger Whittaker type whistling is a completely different thing. And I wanted to mention that because there's a lot of people that look at voice when they're looking at that. Humming to a square dance tune or whistling a tune is very, very different than actually singing a tune, because it has a lot of different vocal characteristics. Do you have comment on that?
I don't, and those are all I've worked with two or three voice teachers, and the terminology that they've all used has not been as formal as what Mel was using, and yeah, so I certainly don't present myself as any sort of expert on this. The other thing that I wanted to kind of cover here is, can you all see something that says audio 1 and user default on your screen right now? It's hard to tell me what's sharing because this is in a pop-up window. Keith is giving me a thumbs up. And so
I can see that.
Okay, so if I drag this around, you're seeing kind of this curve going up and down. And what I wanted to do was, we talk a lot about the harmonic response of various different audio systems. And like I'm using a Sennheiser 935 right now microphone. I also have an Electro Voice 767. And the Sennheiser makes me sound, kind of filters out some of the lower notes. So if I want to sound more Barry Whitish, actually I'll get a Electro Voice 967 because it does wonderful things to my lower register. But if I want to be vocally clear, I really like this Sennheiser microphone. And one of the hard things to display about this is that everything in the audio chain has its own idea of what frequencies it's going to let through and at how much of different frequencies are going to be let through. And this even extends to the room that you're listening to. I can take the exact same audio setup that I use in a church sanctuary that has been converted to a basketball gym where I call on Monday nights. And it's got plywood on the walls and kind of a shape in the front to back, and I take my music in and I set up everything pretty much flat there for give me the best response you can, just reproduce what my sound system should reproduce what I'm sending into it. And then on my Thursday nights I go into Hermann Sons Hall, which is an old German fraternal organization. And this hall, I can't tell you in looking at it why it's so different from the hall that I play on Monday nights, but it just amplifies the heck out of anything low. And so the first thing I do is I take my equalizer and I turn down everything low I can possibly turn down, so that we get, so that I don't get all of that booming and the muddying bass on my notes. And you have a little bit of control over this with unless you've got a full equalizer, which looks something like this thing on your screen, where you have a bunch of slider knobs, like 10 or 15 slider knobs at different frequency ranges where you can adjust what tones are going in. But on almost all audio equipment, you have a treble knob and a bass knob, or a tone knob, which kind of takes this shape. The tone knob kind of takes this shape and, whoops, if I could use this, and moves that back and forth along it. So it amplifies things in the middle frequency. Now, it's really hard for me to demonstrate this to you because the first thing that Zoom does is it decomposes what we're hearing into a bunch of harmonics that look an awful lot like a scale and throws away all of the rest of the information, and then tries to recreate those on your side, so that rather than sending all of the audio across, it's sending only a very small bit of the audio across and trying to recreate it. That's how it's compressing the audio and then replaying the full sound. This is also essentially what MP3 files do. And then whatever speakers you're playing this on, your laptop speakers or your headphones, are also imposing their own different set of shapes on the sound. But I was going to try playing around with this while I was playing, because one of the things that drives me nuts is I absolutely loathe the way that the Hilton amplifier plus Yak Stack make music sound. On the other hand, I understand that they have come up for a very good reason, because they take all of the sound in where male human speech is generally carried, where that information comes through, and kind of throw away all of the rest of the information. Whereas the audio system that I normally use has a fairly flat frequency response all the way through, and I have to be careful about adjusting it to the hall that I'm playing, because sometimes the human speech portion of the music gets very muddy. So I'm going to play a little bit of me.
Dan, can I interrupt?
Yeah.
We have reached and passed the hour.
Okay.
So I want to make a formal closing, and then you can just keep going for those interested.
Sounds groovy.
First of all, let's thank our engineering help, Dan. Let's thank our presenter, Dan. Let's thank all those that have joined us again. One comment from the chat room from Daryl Condenin was a reminder of KISS, keep it simple, stupid. We've gone way beyond the basics here, which is very interesting for a lot of people and not much use for others, because I seem to have survived 55 years without most of that, which I don't know is a good thing or bad thing. But hopefully you guys have gotten something out of this, and some of you a lot, and others just knowing it's in the background if you want to learn more about it or go back and listen. Dan, I assume he's going to be putting this, he's recording it and he'll be putting it back on YouTube again.
Words and all.
And I don't know, I guess that's what I had to say this time. It's, we discussed earlier possibly switching this earlier by 3 hours so that we don't cut into the weekend as much. Dan and I will discuss that privately. But be aware that may be coming up. And it's still a time that is reasonable for West Coast and East Coast, and maybe even a little better for Australia, no problem for Europe. And we got some other good stuff coming up.
So, and I also wanted to touch on, I just looked back because Don is talking. I get a chance to go back and read through the comments in the chat. Katie asked, does anyone know of software that can help determine if you are singing on pitch? I think that if you take something like Logic Pro or a good digital audio workstation, most of them have a plugin that will do auto-tuning, which you have heard as the share effect, or all sorts of rappers use it. Kind of makes your voice sound robotic if you turn it up too high. And this is useful for figuring out if you're on pitch. But What is more important is that your voice is open and loose and flows. And you can, I, I strongly recommend working with a voice coach if you can afford one and find one, um, or record yourself and play back. One of the things that happened is when I started calling, I was calling for a while. People said, "Oh, your voice sounds really good for a caller," which is, it's a thing. And a friend of mine said, "I want to start a band. Would you come over and do some vocals?" And so I did, and we recorded, and my voice sounded absolutely like crap. Now, he was trying to do some really difficult songs, like Nights in White Satin and Whiter Shade of Pale. And if you listen to those, you won't understand why they're difficult until you start trying to sing them. Because it's not like hitting the notes is difficult. And we both said, "Man, my voice sounds like crap. What's going on?" And so we said, "Well, let's try running it through Autotune." And nothing changed. I was dead on every single note. And my voice sounded like crap. And it was only when I loosened up and started not worrying so much about pitch and going around it that my voice sounded much more interesting. So don't worry as much about pitch as worry about open your voice, loosen your voice, let it flow, because when you can start to put that emotion into your voice is going to be much more useful to you in giving a mood to your dancers than hitting the notes and hitting the pitch. The other comment to earlier, Daryl was, I think it was Daryl, was talking about additional chords and other notes. There's an old gag about a rocket or a jazz guitarist plays 30,000 chords to an audience of 3 people, and a rock guitarist plays 3 chords to an audience of 30,000 people. Within that, if you go back and if you want to hear people who are using really interesting chords, George Benson is absolutely amazing. If you listen to George Benson, This Masquerade, he is using all sorts of intervals that we did not cover here, and it's really cool to listen to. And then finally, we'll loop back around to my audio demo here, and then I will shut up and we'll go over to our usual things. So here's something of me stupidly calling to a basic rhythm track.
Hey, but Dan,
Bow to your... Yes?
before you get started, when she was talking about staying on pitch, probably a software to help her with tonal recognition would help her keep where she wants to be.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have any
That's what I've been
experience with
working with a lot is tonal recognition so that I know I'm hearing what I think I hear.
that. Okay.
Or singing what I think I hear.
Cool. Yeah. And recording yourself and playing yourself back is super, super useful.
I was about to say the audio recorder is your friend.
Yes.
Or maybe it's not. It's a great tool, but sometimes it's reality.
And yeah, also be aware of what it's doing to the different ranges in your voice, because sometimes it isn't. Sometimes that is what you sound like, and sometimes that isn't what you sound like. So it helps if you have a trusted friend or a spouse who is willing to say, "Oh my God, that's awful," to help you work with this. So I wanted to play a little with filtering and just show you some things here. And I have no idea how well this is going to work, especially since we're going through the Zoom audio compression and then on to the other things. But just bear with me a moment and see if you can hear the differences in this as me calling along to a basic rhythm track. Bow to your partner. Turn bow to your corner two. Join hands and circle to the left around that ring you do. Allemande left your corner there, turn your partner by the right now. Allemande left one time and a right and left grand. Hand over hand you go till you meet your own. So what I was trying to demonstrate there was you saw that kind of curve on the equalizer that I was playing around with. The way that my voice could go from kind of muted to bright to very dark and muddy. You have controls on your amplifier with the treble and bass and tone control that does the basics of this. And as you set up your hall and your room, have somebody out there listen to you and try to find a reasonable compromise between voice legibility and your voice all being in this space.
Bow to your partner. Turn bow to your corner too. Join hands and circle to the left around that ring you do.
Because if everything is up in there, your voice is super legible, but musically it doesn't always sound great. All right, that's way more than I expected to get through, and thank you all for bearing with me. And I'm surprised that there weren't more brickbats and things thrown at me. And yeah.
Hey, Dan, you did a really nice job. If you have time after everybody leaves, I have some technical questions on how you set up Zoom that I'd appreciate you helping me with.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
It was a long way.
All right, I will stop the recording now.
Thanks, Dan.